Hello, welcome back to the series of AWS training sessions. I'm Sridhar Anshuri. So, in the last session, we discussed about creating the VPC and other networking resources, including subnets, internet gateway, network ACL. So, now we are going to discuss about the NAT. So, what is the use of NAT and what is the purpose of NAT and how we can configure the NAT instance that we are going to look into this session. So, as we discussed in the previous session, so in the previous example, in the previous session, we created two subnets within a VPC, a public subnet and a private subnet. So if we take a public subnet, with the public subnet is going to have an internet gateway attached, and the traffic will be routed through this internet gateway to public internet. So this we saw in our last session. So we have a public subnet, and in the public subnet we are going to have an EC2 instance, and all the traffic from this subnet, all the traffic from this public subnet will be routed through the internet gateway to the public internet. So we saw how to create internet gateway, and we know how to add the routing table, how to create a routing table and add a new routing to route the traffic to the internet gateway and attach this routing to the subnet. So this way, the instances, the EC2 instances which are there in the public subnet can talk to the internet. But how about the private subnet? So the private subnet is not going to get connected to internet because we do not have the routing table attached. So though the internet gateway is attached to the VPC, the public internet cannot be connected onto the private subnet because the traffic is not getting routed through the internet gateway because we did not update the routing entry here to route the traffic through the internet. So if we just have a scenario of like public subnet, private subnet, and don't think about the NAT right now, but if we have a public subnet and private subnet, all the instances in public subnet can talk to the internet. Someone from outside can connect it to the internet, and from EC2 instance we can connect to internet and download some applications. And coming to the private subnet, so no one from outside world can connect to the instance within the private subnet, and from this private subnet we cannot communicate to the outside world. So but in cases we will need to connect to the internet, like for example, like I just configured the private subnet, and within the private subnet I have an EC2 instance. So with my private VPN, if I have the VPN configured onto the VPC, I can directly SSH into this EC2 instance by using the private IP address, or I can SSH into this EC2 instance, and from EC2 instance I can SSH into the private instance. And after getting into the private instance, if we want to download some applications from the public internet, we cannot do that because this is in a private subnet and this EC2 instance cannot be connected to internet. But most of the instances, or most of the times, we'll have a requirement to download the package from the public internet to this one, to the instance within the private subnet. So because we do not have the routing table and internet gateway attached to the subnet, we cannot connect to the internet. But as for security, what we need to do is we shouldn't allow anyone from public internet to connect to our private instance, but we must have a kind of like one-way communication. We can just initiate a connection from private subnet to download something from the internet. So if we want to route the traffic from EC2 instance to the public internet, we can make use of the NAT. So if we install and configure the NAT instance, what happens is we can configure the subnet in such a way that all the instances within the subnets can connect to the NAT instance and go to the public internet and download something back into the private instance. So the connection to the internet can be established from the private subnet. But if we have this kind of configuration, if we if I'm in EC2 instance, I can connect to the public internet through NAT. But if I'm in public internet, and if I want to get into this EC2 instance, I cannot get into the private subnet through the NAT. So this is how we can implement the security. So whenever we don't need that EC2 instances to be exposed onto the public, we have to configure that EC2 instances within the private subnet. But if we want to download the applications from internet, we must be able to connect to the internet from the EC2 instance, and for that we are going to configure the NAT instance. So the benefit of NAT instance is we can establish the internet connection from the EC2 instance, but no one from public internet can access to our EC2 instance. This is a security we need to implement. So we'll look into the AWS console. We go to the AWS console and see how we can configure the NAT instance. But this is the basic concepts of NAT. So NAT should always be residing in a public internet, public subnet. NAT instance should be configured within the public subnet, and we just only need to add the routing to route the traffic from EC2 instance to the NAT, and from NAT to the public internet. So this is the basic concepts of NAT. So we are going to see how we can configure the NAT. So now we understood the basic concepts of NAT and the purpose of NAT. So I have the private subnet and the public subnet. So public subnet, I have the internet gateway attached, and I am routing the traffic through the internet gateway. And for private subnet, I do not have the internet gateway attached, so there is no way I can connect to the instances within the private subnets. So now coming to the instances, I have one public instance. So the public instance is created within the public subnet. So if you see the subnet ID ending with 332, subnet ID ending with 332, that is the public subnet. So this instance is created within the public subnet, and the other instance, this instance is created within the private subnet. So because we selected the property for public subnet, we selected the modify auto assign IP address. So we selected this for public subnet. So I'll go here and go into this options. So this checkbox has been selected. So this checkbox is selected means whenever we create EC2 instances within this subnet, within the public subnet, it will automatically assign a public IP address. So if you go to the EC2 instances, we can see that public instance has the public IP address already assigned because we selected that feature of auto assigning the public IP address. But coming to the private IP address, we don't even have the internet gateway attached, so there's no purpose of having the public IP address. So we don't have the public IP address here for the private instance. So we cannot directly connect to this private instance from public internet because there's no public IP address also. Even if we assign the public IP address, or even if we assign the elastic IP address, we still cannot connect to this instance because the internet gateway is not attached. So now what I did is I just created the two instances within the two subnets, private and public subnet. And next thing is what I did is I copied this private key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to the public instance. I'm going to SSH into public instance, and from public instance I'll try to get into the private instance by using SSH. So the command we can use is if we go to the connect, we can see the command. We can run this command to get onto this instance from the public instance which is there in the same VPC, and see if we have internet connection or not. So in order to connect from public instance to private instance, we need the private key. So what I did is now currently I am in public subnet. So the private IP address of the public instance is 10.0.1.98. The public instance 10.0.1.98. So now I am in the public instance, and in the public instance I'm going to log in as a sudo user, and I'm just going to do list. So here I already have the PEM key, the private key uploaded. So you can use any of the FTP tools like WinSSCP or any other tools to copy the PEM file onto this public instance, because from public instance I'm going to SSH into the private instance, and to SSH from public to private instance we need the private key. So that is the reason I already uploaded the private key, and I have given certain required permissions, read, write, execute permissions, the complete permissions I have given. Now I will be able to connect from public instance to private instance by using SSH. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the private instance and going to select connect. So this is the example command which we can use to SSH from one instance to another instance. So I'm going to copy. See, this command, SSH command, requires the PEM key, and this PEM key we already uploaded onto the by using FTP. You can do the same thing, and I'm going to copy it and going here and just running this command. So I'm telling now currently I'm in public instance which is ending with 1.98. From public instance I'm trying to SSH into this private IP address. So here I am using only private IP address because I do not have the public IP address assigned to this private instance. I can only connect by using the private IP address to the private instance. So I'm going to do enter. See, if you see here, the IP address got changed. So now I am connected to the private instance. So now I am in private instance. So here I am going to do as sudo su, and if I want to install some packages, yum install tomcat 7. So now I'll not be able to install anything onto this server because the internet connectivity is not there. We did not establish the internet connectivity to connect from private instance to the internet. So that's the reason, like, we got an error saying that could not retrieve the mirror relation because it's not able to connect to the internet. So now what I'm going to do is we are going to configure the NAT instance so that I can download something from this private instance. From private instance, I can request to route the traffic through the NAT instance to the public instance and get the application download and install. So we are going to do that now. So now I am on the console. So I'm going to the VPC. So under VPC, we do not have the, just to make sure we do not have the internet gateway. That's the reason we couldn't download anything. So now to create a NAT instance, I'm going to the EC2 console and going to click the launch instance. And here, instead of selecting the NAT, instead of selecting this AMIs, instead of selecting the Linux or Windows AMI, I'm going to go to the AWS Marketplace. So AWS Marketplace has lot of other images. So I'm going to search for NAT. Sorry, instead of AWS Marketplace, we have to go to the community AMIs and search for NAT, and I can select the NAT AMI. So I'm going to select this NAT AMI. So what's going to happen is the NAT AMI, it has the Linux operating system, and on top of that all the required softwares or applications will be installed and configured. So I'm going to go to the configure instance details, and from configure instance details, as I discussed before, the NAT instance should be within the public subnet. So I'm going to select my VPC, the VPC which I created, and instead of creating the NAT in the private subnet, the NAT should always be existing in the public subnet only. So I'm going to select the public internet. I'm going to go to the next, add storage, and 8 GB storage is enough for NAT, and I'm going to add the tag saying instance name should be NAT instance. Configure security group. I'm going to select the existing security group, and to this security group I just made sure that I open all the required ports. I'm just opening everything so that we don't have to go and update the security group each and every time. But this is not a best practice in the real time, because we have to restrict and open only the required traffic. But because we are working with different things, I'm just opening everything so that I don't have to go to the security group and open all the required ports every time. So review and launch, and I have this private key and launch instances. So now the NAT instance is launched. I'll just go here and remove this filter. So it is spinning up this NAT instance. We'll wait for a couple of minutes to get this up. So now the NAT instance is up and running. So we have private instance, we have a public instance, and we have NAT instance. So this is public instance is residing in public subnet, and this private instance is residing in private subnet, and this NAT instance is residing in public subnet too. So even this is residing in public subnet. So next thing what we should do is, after the instance is pinned up and when the instance is in running status, we have to go to the actions, and under networking there's going to be an option called as change source destination check. So this check should be enabled for, this should be disabled for non-NAT instance. Okay, so now the NAT instance has been created. So next thing is what we should do is, from the private subnets, from the instances within the private subnet, whenever we try to connect to the internet, we have to say that the traffic should be routed through the NAT instance to the public internet. So to route the traffic from private instance to the NAT instance, and from NAT instance to the internet gateway and public internet, we have to go and update the routing tables. So I'm going to the VPC. So here if I go to the private subnet has the default routing table, and the default routing table has the default routing entry, which allows us to connect to the instances within the VPC. So now what I should do is, I have to add one more routing entry to say that all the internet traffic should route through the NAT gateway. So in order to edit the routing entry, I can go to the routing table here, or I can even just click this one, click the routing here, routing table, and select the routing and go to the route and add a new route entry. So new route entry, what it should be is, like I have to say like 0.0.0.0.0. So destination is everything, but only thing is the target. So the target, we have to attach the NAT gateway under this target. Okay, if I go to the target, so here instead of selecting the target as internet gateway, now we have to select the target as NAT instance. So the NAT instance here, it will be displayed, it will get the NAT instance here only if we disable the source destination check on this, on the NAT EC2 instance, which we already did that, and save. So now if we go to the subnets, I'm going to filter out by VPC, and if we go to the private subnet and go to the routing table, we see that the new route table has been added. This is to the destination is public internet everywhere, and the routing target is the NAT instance. So now this is how we can configure the NAT instance. So now as we configured the NAT instance, we configured the NAT and we updated the routing table to route the traffic, to route the outgoing traffic from the private instance to internet through routing table. So now we are going to we'll go into the SSH into the private instance and see. So I'm going to the putty here, and now I am already in the private IP address. I'm already in the private instance. Previously install did not work, and we'll try to see if the yum works. I'm trying to install a package Tomcat 7. So now it has to try to connect to the internet, and the connection is getting initiated from the EC2 instance, because this instance still doesn't have the public IP address, and no one from outside can connect it to this instance directly. Only when the connection is initiated from the EC2 instance to outside, the connection will be established, the internet connection will be established. So now if I do this, yeah, now we are getting the packages getting installed. So now, though this is the private instance, we can download the applications from the internet, but we cannot connect from public internet to this one. We cannot SSH or PuTTY, or we cannot even use HTTP protocol, because this instance doesn't even have the public IP address. Just to make sure, 10.0.2.232. So I'm going to the EC2, I'm going to the private instance, 10.0.2.232. This doesn't have the public IP address, and this doesn't have the internet gateway attached. This subnet doesn't have internet gateway attached, but only thing is we added the routing entry in the VPC subnet to route the traffic through the NAT instance to the public internet. And because we already have configured the NAT instance and the routing table is already updated, from this public internet we can connect to the internet. We can initiate the connection from the EC2 instance to the internet to download the applications. And this is not a security threat, because no one from internet can connect to this EC2 instance, because of the two reasons. There is no internet gateway attached to this public private subnet, and there is no public IP address attached to this EC2 instance. So this is how we can configure the NAT. You can just have a practice session by yourself, and try to configure the new VPC with the two subnets, and configure the EC2 instances within the two subnets with the NAT, and see if that works. That's all for today, and we'll see you in the next session.